We realized that it's been about 22 years that Abdu and I have known each other, and Abdu Murray came to visit our church when I was a recent immigrant, and probably the early 2000s. Abdu grew up in a Muslim family, and as a young adult went into law, and like only a lawyer would, went on almost a decade-long journey, I believe, to explore truth, and found truth eventually after a long search in the person of Jesus Christ. And I met Abdu shortly after that, and we've kept in touch over the years, and I realized just more recently that he was doing some work here in New England, at MIT, and other places, and I thought we got to get in touch and see what we can make happen at Anthem. So I'm really excited to have him here with us this evening. I don't consider myself by nature a skeptical person. Some of us are, some of us more suspicious or more, willing to, explore conspiracies or whatever it might be, or just be more skeptical by nature. But I kind of do have a lot of respect for those that do kind of live in that space and respect that. And I've got friends and family members that think in those kind of terms in a way that I tend not to. And so when there's people around me like Abdu that have learned to communicate so clearly and logically and thoughtfully what it means to follow Jesus and our place in the world as people that believe in Jesus, and also those who are exploring him, I really love to lean into what he says, and I've learned so much from him. He's going to bring a talk tonight for 30 minutes or so, and then open the room up for a Q&A. And so I'll kind of wander around with a microphone a little later to answer any of your questions. I won't answer any of your questions. He'll answer your questions, but I'll wander around with the microphone. And I'm so glad that we've got a good few of our church family here tonight. And we are family, and there's nothing off limits. There's nothing you can't ask. There's no judgment or anything like that on questions, but I'd love for you to hear his talk first, and then we'll get to that later. So would you please give a very warm welcome to my friend Abdu Murray.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Well, thank you, Colin, so much for that. It's 22 years. It's been more than 2 decades. It's sort of, you're getting up in the world, well, not up in the world, but up in age, when people say, I've known you for more than 20 years, and you remember the day you met. And it's not the kind of thing that was too long ago in your memory, but it was definitely long ago in terms of the calendar. My name is Abdu Murray. I'm with a ministry called Embrace the Truth. As Colin already said, I came from a Muslim background. I was raised as a Muslim. I was very proud of being a Muslim. And I thought it was the cat's whiskers, man. If you were not a Muslim, you got to hear from me why you should be one. I was born and raised in the United States, but I was very proud of being what I was. Along the way, there were some Christians who responded to what I was saying. Not a lot of them knew what they were talking about, frankly. I had a lot of objections. And most Christians had no idea how to respond to the objections that I was giving them. But there were a few who actually knew what they were talking about. And when they responded to me, they didn't just respond to my question, they responded to me as a person. Because I'm a firm believer that questions don't need answers. People need answers, and they use their questions to get them. So oftentimes we get hung up on the particulars of a question or hanging up on what a certain word means, and we ought to do that. We ought to do that oftentimes with the person in mind. So whether you come to this room and this forum with a Christian background, strong in the faith, and you've been a Christian for a lot of years, or you just became a believer, or you're looking into matters of faith, or you're absolutely convinced this is all bunk, and I'm here to find out how much more bunk this actually is than what I thought 10 minutes ago, you are most welcome. In fact, what I hope you experience is that your question is not answered, but you are answered. You as a person. Your question gets answered along the way, but you as a person get answered. That's what happened with me. That's why I found it so compelling, is not just because it made sense in my mind, which it needed to. I'm a skeptical person by nature, actually. That's why it took me 9 long years. And the reason why the ministry, or the organization I'm a part of, is called Embrace the Truth, is because I recognized something. It took me 9 years to become a Christian after my search first began. But I found sufficient answers to answer my biggest questions within just 2 years. It took 7 more years to wrestle with what this all means and what the consequences for me might be. Because it's one thing to intellectually assent to the truth. It's one thing to say, okay, rationally speaking, I see the evidence, I see the logic, I see the reasoning behind this, and I accept it in my head. It's another thing completely to embrace it. And so we're all about getting to a point where we can actually not only accept it as true, but embrace it as the truth in our lives. Now, what I want to speak about tonight is a relatively heady topic, so if you don't mind my doing so, we're going to have to, if hopefully the brain isn't drained from a full day's work, full day's school, whatever it is, because we're going to go into some heavy stuff. Now, I say that not as a caution, but as hopefully a delight, because these are the questions that people are asking nowadays. Maybe they're the questions you're asking nowadays as well. And as I think about this, I'm reminded of a joke. It's a lawyer joke, and I, being a lawyer, can tell this joke, and you can laugh and not offend me because I'm the one who told it. But it goes like this. There's the story of this guy. He's a lawyer, and he's the guy you think of when you think of lawyer. He's the guy. He's the guy about whom jokes are made. He's a swindler, a cheat. He shaves the edges off the truth a little bit if it helps him win his case, and he's great at this. And so he amasses a huge fortune, having won a bunch of cases, sometimes legitimately, sometimes illegitimately, but he's just got boatloads of money, tons of property. He has this beautiful home in the middle of this huge forest that he loves to have walks in and these kind of things. Well, one day, it's the fall, it's the autumn time, and he's walking through his property. And the leaves are falling, and the streams are streaming, and the squirrels are being squirrely, It's a picturesque setting. And as he's walking, he comes across a bear. And the bear is hungry, and the bear is after him. And it strips its teeth, and it snarls at him, and he knows what that means. So he runs as fast as he possibly can back to the house. But of course, the bear is faster than him. Nature has built the bear to be faster than the man. So the bear catches up to him, knocks him down, and as it raises its huge paw to take a swipe at him, he's on his back, and the bear raises his paw, and he says, "Oh my God!" And the bear suddenly stops, frozen in motion. And the leaves stop falling midair, and the stream stops streaming, and the squirrels stop being squirrely. And a light comes down from the heavens, and a booming voice comes to him, and it says this: "You have denied the truth your whole life, and you have twisted it for your own advantage and taken advantage of people. And now when you're in trouble, you ask me to save you. Why should I save you?" But he's a good lawyer. He knows how to get out of a sticky situation, so he finds a loophole. And he says, I guess it would be hypocritical if I became a Christian right now, but could you make the bear a Christian? So the voice says, "Very well." And the light goes back up, and the leaves start to fall, and the streams start to stream, and the squirrels get squirrely again, and the bear puts his paws together, and he says, "I thank you, Father, for this food I'm going to receive." There's a couple of points to this story. One is that sometimes when you run away from that which seems true and evident and obvious, it eventually catches up to you. And there's no real getting around it. There's no real way to lawyer yourself out of it. And I can tell you, as someone who did try to do that for 7 long years after I found the answers within 2 years, it's a tough thing, and it can be painful. But there's another point to this story as well, is that oftentimes I feel like in this current cultural climate, that people have the perception that Christians are like the bear. They give thanks to their Father as they devour those who are in front of them. And it's often something that I think is true in the culture where they haven't really given the merit and the meat and the words of the Christian faith, whether it's the Bible or the person of Christ, haven't really given him a sampling. They really haven't given him a thought. They've just heard what they've heard or seen what they've seen, whether it's church hurt and someone has hurt them in leadership in the church, or it's the news headlines, or it's just, those Christians are at it again, those bigots, et cetera, et cetera. I go across the United States at various universities, and I'll be at one tomorrow just down the road. I'll be at MIT tomorrow night. And I've spoken at some of the most august places in the United States, and I've just been privileged because I'm speaking at schools I couldn't even gotten into. And yet they listen. And I've noticed something. The tenor of the questions have changed. The tenor of the questions have changed. It used to be the case that when the microphone was there and a young person who was a student, or even a faculty member would come, they would ask a question about biblical contradictions. Doesn't the Bible have horribly irreconcilable contradictions? What about the history of the Bible being so wrong compared to the actual history from various places we get these things? What about artifacts? What about science and faith? Hasn't science put God out of a job? Isn't evolution all we really need? We don't really need to explain all this stuff because of a God who created things out of the dust and created two specific people. Don't we have no more room for this now that we know more things? Those were the questions that used to be asked primarily. They're still being asked. And if you have that question, you are most welcome to ask it tonight. I hope you do. But I would tell you this, culturally speaking, and at the university level, they're not asking those questions primarily anymore. The primary questions they're asking are these: isn't the Bible sexist? Isn't the Bible racist? Isn't the Bible homophobic or transphobic? In other words, the primary question the culture is asking is not, is the Bible true? The primary question they're asking is the Bible good? We call it the good book, but then we read it and we think, my goodness, I would never read this to a child. Are we reading the whole thing? Are we seeing that? That's what I want to talk with you about today. The title of what our evening is together is Dangerous and Delusional. Is Christianity any good for the world? Now we're going to get into the dangerous part, the moral questions, but I do think we need to spend some time on the delusional part. Is it delusional? Is it, even if it was good, is it a fable? Is it a myth, a moralizing kind of thing? Or is it actually based in reality, whether history or science or whatever? So I want to get into all of that in the time we have and then launch into the questions and answers. And I hope you do have some questions. Be thinking of those questions. Whether it's the simplest question or the most complex one you can think of, all of them are welcome. We'll wrestle together on some of these very important issues. In fact, the Q&A is my very favorite portion of what we're going to be doing tonight. So hopefully we'll get there and you'll be ready to do the same thing as well. Now, there are those who think not only the Bible is bad, but there are those who think the Bible is just out to lunch, that it's delusional to be a Christian. Take the words of Richard Dawkins, who in his book, The God Delusion, the best-selling book, The God Delusion, in the early 2000s, had this to say, one of the so-called four horsemen of the new atheism. Richard Dawkins, the scientist out of Oxford University, he said this: a delusion is a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence, especially as a symptom of a psychiatric disorder. God is a delusion, and a pernicious delusion. When one person suffers from a delusion, it's called insanity. When many people suffer from it, it's called religion. That's a powerful statement. That's a powerful statement. And he says it's delusional. But then Victor Stenger was quoted as saying this. I don't know if he actually said it, but the philosopher, late philosopher Victor Stenger, said this about the dangerous part. He said, science will fly you to the moon. Religion will fly you into buildings. That's a bumper sticker argument. Is he right? There's a whole lot wrong with that, I would venture to say, but it's powerful, you know. It's powerful. We have to reckon with this stuff. We really do. If I'm to present to you any credible message about the Christian faith, it has to be not only factually credible, but morally credible as well. And this is tough, because I travel a lot, as I've said before. And I was in Charleston, South Carolina a few years ago at an event to speak there. And if you've ever been to Charleston, you know it's a beautiful area. It's a wonderful resort town, and there's a lot of history. In fact, the first shots that started the Civil War were in Charleston, South Carolina, over at Fort Sumter. There's two features of South Carolina, of Charleston, that are fascinating. The first feature is this, is that there is a very, very tall church that has a very skinny but tall steeple. And there's an ordinance in the city of Charleston that says that no building can be built higher than the top of the spire on top of the church. In other words, the church, the cross, has to be the highest point in all of Charleston, South Carolina. Very reverential towards the church. Very reverential towards the church. That same place where that same church was built, at the time it was built, that same place that lofted the cross so high also had a slave market. And you can go visit it today if you want to. And so you ask yourself the question, how can a place elevate the cross to be the highest point in the land or the local area, yet debase people so much that they treat them like property? How can you reconcile these two juxtapositions? It's a tough thing. We have to do it. Then you look at, the issue of sexism and are women treated as second-class citizens in the Bible? And what about the patriarchy? We hear this word all the time, the patriarchy, the patriarchy. We hear this all the time. And it rings something because of the way the Bible actually describes the earliest people who started the whole movement of the Christian faith, but way, way back in the time of the Hebrews, when even before there were Hebrews, there were the patriarchs. There was Noah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and all these were the patriarchs. And so we get this word that criticizes the idea of a patriarchy. We borrow it from where the Bible begins to speak about this issue, about the patriarchs. We see that as well. And of course, there's the issue of sexuality and gender and all these kind of things. So we see all these things happening, and we see Christians maybe not so kind in the way they speak about these things. What I want to share with you today is an answer to the question, is it dangerous? Followed by, is it delusional? And I want to tackle at least two things in the time we have about the dangerous part. Is it racist? Is it sexist? Is it racist or is it sexist? And then we'll get to the delusional part, and then we'll close before we have questions. Is it dangerous? Is it racist and is it sexist? Years ago, I was 11 years old. I'll be 52 next month. This was 41 years ago. 41 years ago, I remember it like it was yesterday. I'm from Middle Eastern background. I'm of Arab descent. And I grew up in an area where more Middle Easterners were emigrating and having big families and these kind of things. But back when I was a kid, we were still a growing community, sort of small. And we were resented for being a growing community. Well, when I was 11 years old, my younger brother, and a cousin of mine went over to the local pizza shop. And it's one of these pizza shops you don't sit down and eat in. You order your food at a counter service place, and then you leave. Well, we were out in the middle of the summer riding our bikes and doing our thing, and we decided we were going to get some pizza from this local pizza shop. So we pull up to the pizza shop on our bikes, and we go and we order the food. We order the pizza. The guy takes the order, and 25 minutes later, he hands us our two pizzas. And we go outside. Now, we don't go very far. We go right outside the store. It's got, floor-to-ceiling windows, so you can see right into it, and it sees outside. We're standing outside, right outside the door. And because we're 11-year-old boys, we're inherently disgusting. So we use the garbage can outside as the table to eat our pizza on. I have an incredible immunity system now, but that's what we used. So we're eating our pizza on our quote-unquote table, and as we're doing this, I'm just looking back into the store where I just came from, the pizza shop 5 feet from me. And I'm eating my pizza, and I'm really looking at the reflection in the windows of the cars whizzing behind me. Not thinking about anything, thinking about what 11-year-old boys think about, which is this pizza is good, that's all I'm thinking about. And I see something through the glare. I see the guy who literally just gave me my food looking at me with this anger-filled contempt in his eyes. And he has his right hand raised at me in an obscene gesture. He's giving me the middle finger. I'm 11. I think to myself, is he doing that at me? What, is that at me? So I don't know what compelled me. I walked in, and I said, are you doing, in 11-year-old speak, I said, are you doing that at me? And this 19-year-old, 18-year-old, back then I thought he was a man, he's obviously legal enough to be a man, but there he was. And he says to me, that's right, camel jockey, what are you going to do about it? And I can tell you my memory of it, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but my memory of it was he had a cross around his neck. And here I am, this young Muslim Arab boy who was just told that I am less than this man because I have a little more melanin in my skin and because I come from a place that he doesn't like. I drive past that place once in a great while. It's not in my neighborhood anymore. It's in a different city. But once in a while, I pass it. And I had a small sampling of the kind of racism and the kind of prejudice that most people, have to eat a whole meal of in their lifetime. I had but a taste of it. When I drive past that place, it still affects me. It still affects me. And so for the longest time, I thought, as a Muslim, this is what Christianity is about. This is what these white people do. They make people feel like less than themselves. That's what it's about. And I began to look into the words of Scripture and into the tapestry of colors and smells and sights and sounds of the Scriptures. And I begin to realize something. I want to sustain this for you today. The Bible is often blamed for the very problems it can be the solution for. It's blamed for racism, it's blamed for sexism, but I think it's actually the solution to the very ills it's blamed for. So let's look at race, because oftentimes people think the Bible condones slavery. The slavers, they use the Bible to justify their slavery and to denigrate people based on their race as if they were less than them. That's what they did. And that obviously condones slavery. You look at the pages of Scripture, and you can see this is the regulations for how you own a slave, how you treat a slave, all these kind of things, how you can buy them and acquire them. It seems to condone this idea of slavery. It seems so racist because the Jews are important people and they're the ones who are separated and special above everybody else and all these things. But it's funny, I look at this, and there's a couple of things. As you look at the context, and I have a book out there called More Than a White Man's Religion, where I go into all of the various passages of the Bible that seem to condone slavery. And you'll notice something, if you read them in context, you'll notice something about those passages. They never actually condone slavery. They never do it. What they do is they regulate what was called indentured servitude. So back then, because of the way the economy worked, thousands and thousands of years ago, you didn't have banks you could go to for various loans and various kind of things. But if someone got in debt to you, they could either go to prison, debtor's prison, or they could sell their services to you and work the debt off. And that is what became a servant. Now, the word slave is used in the Bible, but the word slave has many different connotations. So, for example, if you were to say the word foot, if I just said foot, what am I referring to? You don't have any idea because you have no context. Am I referring to a 12-inch span, or am I referring to the things at the end of my legs? You don't know until I say, my foot hurt, and now you know which one I'm talking about. The word slave in the Bible can be translated in multiple ways. Many of them are complementary, actually. My name, Abdu, is an Arabic word that shares its same root with the Semitic language of Hebrew, and the word in Hebrew for slave is obed. Abed, is how you say it in Arabic, and so my name actually means slave. It means slave of God, his slave. It's a compliment. In fact, in the Bible, you see a prophet named Obed. His name means slave. Obadiah, the word is slave, slave of God, right in there. It's all over the place. It doesn't always mean a bad thing. It can mean servant or someone who has bonded themselves to another person. And so when you see the regulations in the Bible, what's going on is not what happened in antebellum southern slave trade, whether it was the North Atlantic slave trade between England and France and the United States, or if it was just what was happening here in the United States. That was race-based chattel slavery. Race-based means it was based solely on where they came from. And it was chattel slavery, meaning you owned a person as property. In the Old Testament, what was regulated wasn't race-based at all. Your race didn't matter. And it wasn't even chattel slavery. It was indentured servitude. In fact, every 7 years, whether the debts are paid off or not, the owner of the debt, or the so-called master, was required to let all of the servants go, even if their debt was not paid. And even if that hadn't happened yet, and the year of Jubilee came around, the 49th year, if you were a slave or an indentured servant for 5 minutes, and the year of Jubilee happened, you were to be set free. And when you were set free, you were supposed to be given property by your master liberally, the Bible says, liberally from within his land and his livestock and his money. Why? So that you would never fall into debt again. The Bible did not condone slavery. It regulated out of existence indentured servitude. The exact opposite. And you see this issue with ethnicity as well, is that when you see this idea of were the Jews special and all these things, they were chosen to be God's people to bring about the Messiah, the Savior of the world. That's true. But here's the interesting thing. When you look at the Bible and you say, well, does God favor them because of their ethnicity? Look at the ethnicities around, especially in that time. They were all virtually physically identical. You couldn't tell what a Canaanite and an Israelite and a Hittite and an Ammonite and an Amalekite, what they looked like outside of their language or the way they dressed. They looked indistinguishable from each other. But what's interesting is this. There were times when God used the Israelites as an instrument of judgment against other cultures because not of their skin and not because of the way they spoke and not because of the foods they ate, but solely because of their practices. when they were engaging in child sacrifice, where they were burning little babies alive as sacrifices to Molech or to Baal or all these gods, they were sacrificing their children, or they were committing temple prostitution, or they were doing all these raids to maraud against weaker bands of people around them. God had warned them several times in the Bible, if you don't stop this, judgment is coming. And he used the nation of Israel to judge those people. So he judged them not based on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character. That should sound familiar. Dr. King did not pull that out of the air. Well, I guess he kind of did, because it came from the Bible. But that notion is not just something he just thought up. He was inspired by this. And here's why. Because whenever the Jews or the Israelites did the same exact practices, and they did them, whenever they did those abominable practices, God used foreign nations, non-Israelites, to judge them. Their ethnicity was not important. The morality of what they were doing is what was important. Judging by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin or of the nature of what it is they do in life in terms of their ethnicities. See, the interesting thing is, oftentimes we move to the New Testament and you see that Jesus oftentimes makes the hero of the story a person who's not a Jew. You'll see it time and time again as you read the Bible. I can rattle off multiple instances of this. The Syrophoenician woman, which is near and dear to my heart, because the Syrophoenician woman came from Tyre and Sidon, 2 towns that are in Lebanon, the place of my heritage. And he made her the teacher of all the people who were there. He turned her into their teacher and honored her because of her question and because she was looking for truth. Then you go to John chapter 4, and you see the same thing, where Jesus encounters a Samaritan woman. This is interesting, friends, because Samaritans and Jews hated each other. There was a tremendous amount of ethnic and religious tension between the two of them. In fact, I could go on and on about this. I won't necessarily spend a ton of time on this, but the reality is that the Samaritans hated the Jews, and the Jews hated them right back because they had disputes over whose land was whose. They had religious disputes. Whose religion is the true religion? And they had all kind of ethnic disputes. Who is really the pure blood from Abraham? Does that sound familiar to you? That sounds exactly like the Middle East conflict today. This is not a new conflict, friends. This is just an old one. And so Jesus walks into Samaria, a place that should hate him, and he sees a woman at a well, at Jacob's well. As he encounters her, it's already a bad situation because women and men shouldn't be talking alone together like this. And a Jew would never talk to a Samaritan. In fact, the Bible goes out of its way to say, when she says, "Why are you talking to me?" The Bible says, because Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. And then he begins to unmask her. Read it in John chapter 4. Read it. It's one of my favorite verses, one of my favorite passages of the Bible. This amazing encounter that Jesus has with a Samaritan woman, where she has a pretty big ethnic chip on her shoulder, a pretty big religious chip on her shoulder, all kinds of issues going on about these Jews and what they've done to us and all these things. And as Jesus unmasks all of her issues, he begins to tell her that it's not about being Samaritan or being Jewish. It's not about worshiping in this place or worshiping in this place. That's not the important thing. God is looking for those who worship him in truth and in spirit, because God is truth and spirit. And so he's not looking for your ethnicity to be a boulevard to get you into the doors of the church, nor is he making your ethnicity a barrier to keep you out of the doors of the church. God is looking for those who worship him in truth and in spirit. You included, young lady. That's what he told her. And then she was so excited by this message that there was going to be this unity that's going to happen that she ran back to her village of Sychar, and all these Samaritans who traditionally hate Jews spent 3 days with this Jewish man, and they began to follow him. Now, I want you to notice something else, because the Bible's often been called sexist as well. If the Bible was racist and sexist, what you would not expect is any of the heroes of the Bible to be non-Jews and women. And this woman is both non-Jewish and a woman. She's also the hero of the story, because she goes and she becomes the first missionary to the people of Sychar. And there is reconciliation between two peoples who hate each other. And he commissioned her, not his disciples, Not some highfalutin guy with a lot of education, and certainly not a man. He gave it to her. And she accomplished the task that was before her because of the fire blazing in her eyes and the passion with which she had been ignited by Christ himself. You know, modern theories, whether it's critical race theory or various other things, and I'm not going to get into all that just in specific, but I want you to notice something. Modern identity politics essentially does this, and I think it's a disservice to all of us. I think it does go and give us something worth thinking about, but sometimes I think it doesn't go far enough, actually, ironically. That's its biggest shortcoming, is that what it does is it makes you and I defined by our ethnicities or our gender, is that you are defined by this. This defines what you are. And that's a problem, because it doesn't really give you the full definition. Because what Jesus does to the Samaritan woman is he says, you are not defined by being a Samaritan, and I am not defined by being a Jew. No, you are defined as inherently and intrinsically and infinitely valuable because you bear God's image. You see, what I think we ought to recognize is that our gender and our ethnicities can be expressions of who we are, but it's the biblical idea of being made in God's image that defines what we are. So your ethnicity is valuable. Your gender is valuable. Being a woman is a unique and beautiful expression of God's image on you. Being a man is the same thing. Being black, being white, being Middle Eastern, being Indian, being South American, whatever it happens to be, all is an expression of God's beauty. But it is not the definition. Because if it were, then all of the racism in the world would be justified because we're all different. It can't be definitional. There's got to be something about you and me that does not depend on the physical, but something spiritual. Now, just so you know, I mean, a lot of the critics of Christianity, these brilliant people, are saying Christianity is racist and sexist. But then I hear from some of the most brilliant minds in American history. You know, Frederick Douglass, if you've never read anything by Frederick Douglass, you do yourself the favor and read the things that Frederick Douglass wrote. A freed slave who worked hard to achieve freedom for other slaves as well. It was part of the abolitionist movement. In fact, so brilliant was this man that at the second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, after he gave his speech, Abraham Lincoln invited Douglass to share the stage. And when Abraham Lincoln, one of the greatest orators to ever grace the American public scene, one of the greatest speakers ever, after he was done with his speech, turned to Frederick Douglass and said, Mr. Douglass, what'd you think? And Douglass said to him, Mr. President, that was a fair effort. He's brilliant. So all of our critics say Christianity is racist at its core. And there are obviously expressions of it that can be. But here's what Douglass says. Between the Christianity of this land, which was the Christianity that allowed slavery, so between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. So wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Indeed, I can see no reason but the most deceitful one for calling the religion of this land Christianity. Because they were giving into the slave mentality and this racism that was there. You know, here's an interesting little fact. There's a thing called the Slave Bible. You can buy one right now. Go on to Amazon, you can get a Slave Bible right now. The Slave Bible is a Bible that was heavily edited. They gave it to the slaves. They cut out all of Exodus, all of it, got rid of it. Any mention of liberation for slaves, they removed it. They literally physically would cut it and get rid of it. Paul's letters that talk about liberation, they got rid of those. So the slaves had this incredibly edited version of the Bible. The real version was still circulating amongst the churches, but they knew eventually the Bible is going to get translated or transmitted to the slaves. And if they find out the truth, they'll demand their equality. Well, here's the question. If the Bible was so racist, if the Bible so obviously condoned slavery, why edit it at all? Why would you need to cut anything out? if it was so obviously sexist and racist and slave condoning. But they edited it for a reason, because they know it preaches liberation. But they needed to baptize their evil with something. And it was this perverse version of Christianity. It goes back to something Dr. King said, and it's not I think it's poetic that just 2 days ago we celebrated his legacy. Because he drew his inspiration from the idea that there are objective moral values. And objective moral values have to be based in something objective, and it can't be human opinion. Because if it's based on human opinion, then it's not objective anymore, is it? It's based on what the culture thinks is moral for that day. And long ago, actually not too long ago, it was considered moral to own people as property. It was even legal. It was wrong then, and it's wrong now. Human beings cannot be the arbiters of what's good and what's true. We're just terrible at this. And that's why Dr. King said this about the oughtness, things that ought to be, based on something objective beyond ourselves, when he says, I refuse to accept the idea that the idols of man's present nature make him morally incapable of reaching up for the eternal oughtness that forever confronts him. There is no oughtness, no eternal oughtness, unless there is a God who is the standard for that morality. Just to wrap up the whole idea of racism and sexism, Michael Kruger, the historian, pointed this out. We often think that Christianity is super sexist and keeps women down and all these things. But the reality was in history that during the earliest stages of the Christian movement, the earliest stages, women were leaving different religions, pagan religions, different forms of Judaism, the Roman religions, all these things, and flocking to the Christian movement. They were flocking to Christ, and they were flocking to his church after he departed this earth. And Kruger said that this was an embarrassment to most other people because they thought, look at this, because women were considered second-class citizens back then by a lot of people. Look at this. This is not a real religion, this Christianity. This is a religion for women and children. If it was so sexist, why were women flocking to the Christian movement in the early years? Because Christ had valued them and given them the value that they had always sought. Can I give you a short story about that? The Mary and Martha story. Maybe you know the story. Mary and Martha are two sisters. They're sisters of Lazarus. Lazarus who dies and gets raised from the dead again by Jesus. Well, Mary and Martha are two sisters, and Martha is very busy all the time. She's making sure everything's done. Mary, not nearly as committed to helping. But Jesus and the boys are coming over for dinner. And Martha is about the house, making sure everything's prepared. She's very Middle Eastern, got to have the hospitality coming out your ears. So she's working on it. Well, Jesus gets there early, and he's sitting there. And Mary sits down at Jesus' feet, and she begins to learn from Jesus. And Martha is ticked. She's mad. She's like, you're not helping me. Now, here's what's interesting. Martha has been so used to being put in her place, which is either with the children or in the kitchen, that when she sees a woman outside of that, she gets offended. She's been so acculturated to the sexism around her that when she sees a woman break the mold and begin to learn something on her own, she can't stand it. So she gets upset. Now, she is irritated because she's not being helped very much. And of course, the moral of the story includes, don't be so busy that you don't stop and smell the Messiah once in a while. You need to do that. But there she is, and Martha says to Jesus, Jesus, don't you care that Mary has left me to do all the work? Tell her to come help me. What's interesting is she never even, the idea of asking Jesus to help her never occurred to her. Make Mary come help me. And what does Jesus say? He says, Martha, Martha, you are worried about many things, but only one thing is needful. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken from her. Mary and Martha were not entitled to an education, and they certainly didn't have the free will to choose an education over their place in the kitchen. But at Jesus' feet, Mary had the ability to choose and be educated. And Jesus was saying, Martha, it will not be taken from her, not even by you. Join us. Enjoy this right. Enjoy this equality that has been yours since the beginning, and dastardly men have taken it from you. No longer. No longer. I think when I look at these things, you can see that the Bible is actually a solution to the very problems it's being blamed for. But now the question is it true? Is it actually true? I'm going to race through this part so that we can get to the Q&A. Because there's some things here that I think are really remarkable about this. You know, when someone like a Dawkins says the Bible is delusional, or Christian faith or religion is delusional, you know, that word delusion, it has to have a standard by which you judge the delusion. Because something can only be delusional if it's non-rational. And if it's not rational, then rationality exists. And if rationality exists, it has to be grounded in something. It can't just be this thing that floats about. Oh, there's rationality. Look at it. Isn't it driving nice today? You know, you don't do that. You don't think of these things that way. So rationality is the standard by which you judge something to be delusional. So he's already positing that there is something like the mind, something rational about the universe and the way it works. But there are brilliant people. And I'm going to quote for you two atheists, Thomas Nagel and Raymond Tallis, both brilliant men. Thomas Nagel out of New York University, professor of philosophy out of New York University. Raymond Tallis out of the UK at Oxford, and he is a neurologist and an evolutionist. And they both say this, that you cannot account for human rationality. It makes no sense to account for human rationality based on pure physical evolution. It just doesn't work. You can't account for it. You just can't do it. This is what Raymond Tallis says. Now, this is a longer quote. Bear with me for a moment. But it's important. This is what he, as a non-Christian, says. It is a bitter irony that two of our greatest intellectual achievements, the theory of evolution and neuroscience, should be used to prop up a picture of humanity that's not only wrong, but degrading. I feel the misuse of bioscience all the more acutely since I have been a biologist of sorts all my life, a doctor and a clinical scientist, and my research has been in the field of neuroscience where I have seen huge advances that have amazed and inspired me. Listen now. The biologistic image of humans, meaning all you are is biology. You're just a meat computer. You're a biochemical machine, and that's all you are. There is no mind, there is no soul, apart from your brain. The biologistic image of humans effectively denies the centrality, even the possibility of precisely those unique capacities that have made humans able to theorize about evolution or to develop neuroscience. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying that you're using evolution and neuroscience to debunk the existence of something that can establish why we're rational. But the very fact that we even have evolutionary theory and neuroscience proves that we're rational, which means that they can't be the last answer. He says this, if On the Origin of Species, Darwin's great book, really were the last word on humanity, it could not have been written. And if our consciousness were totally explained by brain science, we would have no brain science to explain it. Thomas Nagel. An account of human beings' biological evolution must explain the appearance of conscious organisms as such, since a purely materialistic, in other words, non-spiritual, no design in the world, since a purely materialist explanation cannot do this, the materialist version of evolutionary theory cannot be the whole truth. In other words, rationality, absent something immaterial about the world, something that's not just stuff, rationality doesn't even exist. So you can't even judge Christianity as delusional unless you're willing to say that something beyond the physical even exists in the first place. The objection actually proves the thing you're objecting against. Science is simply a method, friends. It's not something that flies you to the moon. Science doesn't get you there. Scientists get you there, and they use science to do it. But science also gives you atom bombs and germ warfare. So science is amoral. It's not a thing that does anything moral. It's a method. And what does it do? It draws inferences that involve free will, that involve logic about the nature of the universe and what's going on around us, and then draws conclusions based on that. And from that, we can see some pretty amazing things, by the way. Some pretty amazing things. Let me race through them for you. The first thing is this. The standard Big Bang cosmology says this, that the universe, all matter, energy, space, and time, began to exist at a finite point in the past. How long ago? That's not the issue right now. But the standard cosmology says matter, energy, space, and time all began to exist at a finite point in the past. Now, if matter, energy, space, and time began to exist, the thing that creates those things has to be immaterial, I have a different kind of energy than all the energy in the universe put together, has to be spaceless, and has to be timeless. Why? Because if you are creating matter, you can't be matter in the first place because you can't precede your own existence. So matter can't create itself. So the thing has to be immaterial, not made of stuff. Greater than all the energy in the universe because it created it in the first place, has to be spaceless because if you create space, you have to be spaceless, and it has to be timeless because you created time in the first place. What does an immaterial, enormously powerful, spaceless, and timeless being sound exactly like? It sounds just like God. The heavens declare this, and they scream it out. You know, it was Robert Jastrow who said that it's as if the scientists have finally climbed and scaled the mountain of knowledge only to find a bunch of theologians sitting at its summit for thousands of years. And they say, when did you guys get here? But it's also biological life, and I'm going to close with this. It's biological life in this world that looks and appears, not only the universe itself, but the biological life within it looks and appears designed. It looks and appears designed in such an incredible way. You look at DNA, for example, and there's 3.1 billion bits of information in the human genome. And they're finding more and more that the so-called junk DNA isn't really junk after all. In fact, these guys won a Nobel Prize recently to discover all the functionality of the so-called junk DNA. And you see this intricate code that's woven into each one of us. Billions of bits of information in each DNA strand, and your cells have trillions of those. And they're dazzling in their complexity. It was Francis Crick, along with Watson, who discovered the double helix structure of the DNA strand. And he said this: an honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle. So many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. In other words, you can't get it by accident. He won't go all the way. He says it's almost a miracle. He can't give an example of why it's not a miracle, but there you have it. Now, why do I bring this up? I want to show you something. I want to show you a picture of something. This is, and with the lighting of the picture itself and the lighting in here, it doesn't do it quite justice, but that's the rose window of York Minster Cathedral. When you go to this and you look at it yourself and you're thinking, my goodness, it's dazzling. This artistry, in its symmetry, in the brilliance of the colors, it's dazzling. It's truly an artist created this. An architectural artist and someone who knows what they're doing with color created that. Let me show you something else. The one on the right is DNA. If you look down the double helix, down the axis of the double helix, that's what DNA looks like. That one was made by an artist, and that one was made by accident. And this one conveys enough information to create a whole human being. Eye color, hair color, height, predilection to diseases, all kind of stuff in that one. And you look at this, and you think to yourself, my goodness, when the Bible describes how you and I were created, it doesn't say you were built. It doesn't say you were designed. It doesn't say you were constructed. Psalm 139 says you were knit together in your mother's womb. When I say the word knit, what is the first image that comes to your head? It's a grandmother type, sitting on a chair, doing her cross, loop, hatch, whatever they do when they knit. She's doing that. There's an intimacy to the whole process. You know, I have this little thing in my house. It's the most valuable possession I have in my house, other than my wedding ring, my wedding photos, and my pictures my kids drew me. It's this wonderfully important relic. It's a little purple sweater. You know, I'm from Michigan. You guys are from here. You know what cold is. You own a sweater or two, I'm sure. I own a few sweaters too. This sweater that I have, that I value so much, won't even fit on my right hand. That's how small it is. It's this little purple sweater that my mother knit while she was pregnant with me to bring me home from the hospital in. I brought home all my kids in that same sweater. When I think of that sweater, and my mom doing what she did to knit it, what she did was she thought, my boy, my son, Abdu. Knitting is not just building. Knitting is intimacy. And you were not just knit together haphazardly. You were knit intimately. That's what Psalm 139 tells you and tells me. So let me wrap up with this. I think Christians can be dangerous, absolutely. But I think those who have stormed the gates of the slave ships and the moorings of those things that held on to slavery and sexism and racism and all these things and fought for women's right to vote and all these things, they had as their backbone the scriptures themselves. That's what Wilberforce used and others did as well, the abolitionist movement. When you look at, is it delusional, you see the scientists look, and I could name them off, rattle off a bunch of them, who look at the handiwork of God and said, my goodness, I find myself as I study your universe thinking your thoughts after you. Is it delusional? I don't think it is. And I think of this as I close. Joseph Plunkett's poem, I see his blood upon the rose. You know, the cross is the central reason why not just any religion is true, but the Christian religion is true. Because he died as a matter of history, and I can defend that during the Q&A if you'd like. And then he rose again as a matter of history, not a matter of mere hope, but as a matter of history. And that is the central claim of the Christian faith, that you and I owe God a debt. You and I have sinned, and we have fallen short, and we owe him a debt because he is righteous and he is just, but he's also merciful in that he sends his only son so that he pays the debt for you. And if you but accept the free gift, you can have the life that he has after he rose from the dead. Sin is dealt with, the punishment happens, but the glory comes after with the resurrection. And those central facts make the Christian faith true. Plunkett says, I see his blood upon the rose, and in the stars the glory of his eyes. His body gleams beneath eternal snows. His tears fall from the skies. I see his face in every flower. The thunder and the singing of the birds are but his voice, and carven by his power, rocks are his written words. All pathways by his feet are worn. His strong heart stirs the ever-beating seas. His crown of thorn is crowned with every thorn. His cross is every tree. Whether it's in the DNA, or in the celestial bodies that are out there, or in the value that you and I have, no matter what our race or what our gender, his cross is in everything. I offer him to you, and I hope we can engage on some good stuff here in the Q&A. Thank you guys for giving me some time. God bless you. All right. So we're going to do the Q&A. Essentially, Colin will be running around with the microphone. Feel free to ask any question you want. Honestly, it can be on the topic we just discussed, or any topic having to do with faith and any other issue you'd like to talk about. I'm happy to do that. No question is off limits. No question will be judged for being too hard or being too softball. We'll just go ahead and go for it. So please, go ahead and raise your hands if you'd like to ask a question. And yeah, there we go. First one's already up.
So aren't there other religions that are based in history as well?
Yeah, thank you. What's your name?
Ruth.
Ruth, thank you so much, Ruth. The answer is yes, in a way. So here's what I would say, is that there is one central claim. So a lot of these religious systems also have histories, history of their development, how they developed over time, but also history of some of the stories that are included in some of their holy books, whether they have books or they have oral traditions, and that's true. Some of them are not based in history at all. There are various forms, for example, of some stories in Hinduism that don't necessarily even want to have a basis in it happened in this year when this guy was reigning as the king of this and this kind of thing, and you can verify it through documents. There are some religions that don't even care about that kind of a thing. The religion of my birth, my former faith, was based in, at least claimed to be based in history. The question now is, do we test it? How do we test that history to see if the claims made that justify the system actually are historical? So give you an example of what I mean. I don't mean, was Muhammad a person? The Prophet Muhammad, was he a person? And was Mecca a city and all that? Because we know that Mecca was a city and these various things were going on. We know this is a historical thing. The question is, are the claims that are uniquely Muslim historically backed? Are the claims that are uniquely Hindu or Buddhist or whatever it might be, are they historically backed in terms of how they justify that system of belief? So, for example, in Islam, there's a story called Isra wal-Baraj. It's the story of how Muhammad was transported to the Dome of the Rock, and he was occulted up to heaven, body and soul up to heaven. And there he engaged in dialogue and conversation with Moses and Jesus and Abraham and all these things. Now, that's considered a central miracle that there has to have some kind of corroboration for. Now, what you'll find, though, in the Islamic sources is there's no one who actually saw it. There's no one who actually said, I was there. And the documents that do record it aren't recorded right away at the time. So there's a lot of distance between those two things. There's not a lot of eyewitness testimony about it. The Christian faith has lots to commend it in terms of its history. So when you look at the way the Bible actually talks about the various events that happen, what you'll see is there are lots of events that say, when this person was Pharaoh, or in the third reign of this person, or the dynasty of this happened in this month, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Isaiah saying. So you have this like very specific thing, like this is the time it happened. You see this in the New Testament as well. When Luke begins to give his story about what happened to Jesus, he places it in terms of who was the tetrarch, who was the governor, who was reigning at that time, who was even the emperor of Rome at the time. And so you have this rootedness where there's all these extra historical references that can say, did this actually happen? Can we go back? Can we shove a spade into the ground, turn it over, and find out if that actually happened that way? And the good news is that we're seeing that over and over again about various, facts in the Bible. The biggest thing, though, is this. It's not, are the various facts corroborated? Is it the central fact corroborated? And what I would offer is that the crucifixion, and I can quote many, many non-Christians to this effect, the crucifixion of Jesus is this is John Dominic Crossan, who's not exactly someone who believes in Orthodox Christianity. John Dominic Crossan says that Jesus was crucified is as sure as any historical fact can ever be. Okay, so that's that. Then we have the resurrection. The central claim of Christianity is not that the Bible is inspired by God, though I believe it is, or that, Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene, as it was stated in Luke's gospel. Those aren't the central facts. The central fact is he died, and then he rose from the dead. And we have a ton of evidence, both biblical and extra-biblical, to talk about that specific thing, that we have not only the testimony of the apostles themselves, who were either willing to suffer death or did in fact die for their belief that they saw the risen Jesus with their own eyes. We also have the Roman historians like Cornelius Tacitus, and we have Pliny, and we have Josephus and others in various forms and in various levels of credibility who corroborate this claim. So the central fact, the important thing is not do other systems have history. The issue is there central fact that proves them to be true? Is that historical? And I would say that the greatest amount of evidence for any miracle that establishes a religion to be true is the Christian faith because of the resurrection. So they do have history, but the question is about what? And that's the big issue. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for the question. Excellent question. Yes, we have some more. I'll let Colin pick so I don't have to be the bad guy.
Especially as someone who grew up not in the faith, but maybe necessarily wasn't like a bad person, what are your thoughts on the dangers of not believing or not accepting the gift?
Great question. What's your name again?
Brooke.
Brooke. Thank you, Brooke. Great question. Essentially, that's moralism. Moralism is the idea that if you're a really good person, you can go to heaven. That's the counter to, and by the way, a lot of religions believe that. If you're a really good person, God will look at you and say, you know what, you gave it a shot, I want you in, come on in, that kind of a thing. Islam is like that. The faith of my birth is like that. If you do enough good things, you will attain God's mercy, because you need God's mercy in Islam, you do. But you will attain God's mercy, and then if God deems your scale to be heavy on the good deeds you did, you go to heaven. If he deems it to be light and it's heavier on the bad stuff, you go to hell. Okay, that's Islam. There's a little more to it than that, obviously, but that's Islam. There's various forms of Judaism that would say that. There are lots of other religious systems. In fact, Hinduism and Buddhism both share the idea of the cycle of death and rebirth, that you need to come back again to work off the karma from a previous life. And when you work off the bad karma and you accrete to yourself good karma, in Hinduism, you'll either become divine and you'll become the Atman, the Atman becomes Brahman. Or if you're a Buddhist, as Buddha taught it, you become nothing. Your goal is not to exist anymore. Your goal is to become just like dissipated into nothingness. And that's the goal. But you have to work off your karma, and you have to do various devotions and all these different things in order to get there. All religions are fundamentally different. They are, except in this one way, that you can participate and are responsible for your own salvation, or whatever they call it. The Christian faith says, no, that's not true. Here's the danger of this. Here is the danger of it. If I were to have a magical app on my phone that could access all of your thoughts that you've had for the past 24 hours and put them on that screen right now for everyone to see, what you thought of the person who cut you off, what you thought of the person who's getting the promotion that you deserve, what you thought of yourself in those moments, or the lusts of your heart, or the desires, or the things you looked at and shouldn't have. I don't think anybody would be okay with that. There's something about us that isn't good. Does not mean it's not valuable. It just means it's not good and needs to be changed. And so that's what the Christian faith has to offer you and me. It's not that you can pull yourself up by your own moral bootstraps and then earn God's heaven or God's salvation. No. It says that you are incapable of doing it. Think about the logic of this. If we are the problem, we cannot be the solution because we're the problem. We don't have a problem, we are the problem. So we need someone else who's not us to save us from us. And that's the whole idea of a savior. So the danger in believing in yourself, in believing in your own goodness on all these things, is one, I think there's a salvation problem because you're going to stand before a God who is all-seeing and completely just and completely righteous, and you're going to say, gimme, it's mine. I deserve it. You owe me. You know, I was sitting across the table from a woman who was a very accomplished lawyer. And she was serving at church, by the way. She was serving at church. Her and her husband had served at church for 15 years. And they were serving the young people at church and doing a great job of it. Loved doing it. Didn't believe in Jesus. Believed in God, didn't believe in Jesus. In other words, they believed that Jesus was a good guy and he could teach them some good stuff, but he didn't really have to die on the cross. And as we're sitting there, we're talking, me and her husband. She tells me, why do I need Jesus for? I mean, I'm a good person. That's good enough to get to heaven, isn't it? I mean, why do I need him for? What do I need him for? His moral teachings? Yeah, great, but I don't need him for anything else other than that. So I asked her a question. My question was this. Are you a peaceful person? Yes. Do you try to resolve conflicts whenever you see them? Oh, yes. That's great. Terrific. We should give you the Nobel Peace Prize. She goes, well, that's ridiculous. I'm like, yeah, I agree. It's ridiculous. You don't deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, do you? She's like, no, I've done nothing to deserve the Peace Prize. I said, so you don't deserve the Peace Prize. What makes you think you're good enough to deserve heaven? I don't deserve the Peace Prize. I don't deserve heaven. This man-made prize you're not good enough for. But heaven, you think you've done enough? You know what's funny is her husband was sitting there actually. And he said, yeah, you can probably tell where this is going. It's going a little different direction than you might think, though. He said, oh my goodness, I just realized something. My whole life, my father provided for us, and he was an incredibly good man, but he never hugged me once. And that's why I think of God as this impersonal force for good, but he doesn't actually love me because my dad never said it. I know he did, but he never said it. And he said to her, your dad only told you he loved you whenever you did something worthy of it, whenever you got into the best school, whenever you graduated law school, whenever you got into the best law firm, and when you made partner, that's when he said he loved you, and you always said it bothered you. And I asked her, I said, isn't it interesting that what you want, you don't like the idea of unearned grace because you couldn't earn your earthly father's love until you earned it. You couldn't get it until you earned it. But now your heavenly Father is saying you don't have to earn it, and it's foreign to you. And these were her words, her exact words, pardon it. She said, oh my God, that's it. And they became believers after that. The danger of not accepting the free gift is that you stand on your own. You stand on your own. And how many of us, please don't raise your hands, but how many of us have tried to stand on our own and thought, this time make it. This time, I'll make it. This time. And you know you're not. Not only do you stand on your own, but you also risk losing something that's freely given to you, which is not only Christ's righteousness, but also the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. And so you lose something not only on the other side of heaven, but you lose something in this life as well. There's so much more to life than just being happy. There's joy offered to us, and we miss it. So that's what I think is the biggest difference. That's what I realized was the biggest difference after I became a Christian, is that my religious moralizing didn't get me anywhere. It certainly didn't get me joy, and certainly didn't get me any sense of security. But Christ did. But Christ did. Thank you, Brooke. Right behind you.
So I didn't grow up with faith in my life, and I came from a pretty rough background. And about 6 years ago, I was going through a rough patch, and I was taking care of a man with a stroke, and his wife was a Jehovah's Witness. And so she was like, can I pray with you? Can I teach you about God? Or whatever. And so I was like, I was open to it. So as soon as I started telling people that I met a Jehovah's Witness woman who tried to teach me about God, the very first thing I heard was, oh my God, don't do it. It's a cult. And it kind of bothered me a lot because I'm like, how can something be a cult when they're trying to teach you something good? They're trying to teach you about God.
Yeah.
And so I sat with my husband and I asked him, would he be all right if I did it? And at first he was kind of skeptical because he had also heard the same thing. And he's like, I don't know how this is going to change you or whatever, but if you really feel the need, go ahead and do it. So I started studying, and shortly afterward, he started to see the change in me. And so he was like, wow, this is incredible. And so I started really getting deep into it, and I would do Bible study every week. And then I started talking to Christians, and they would be like, so once I started getting into the Jehovah's Witness, they were trying to almost convert me, and so it's been 6 years, and I still kind of talk to those people, and I did Bible study. But my conflict is, whenever I talk to Christians, they're like, it's a cult, it's a cult. And then when I talk to Jehovah's Witness, they're like, they don't believe in the same things, and it's like, they say that they're the first Christians, the first followers of Christ. And so my conflict is, if Christians believe in Christ, and Jehovah's Witnesses believe in Christ, why do they have a conflict with which one is better? And it kind of tears me up inside because I'm so confused. And I know that Jehovah's Witnesses do things a lot different. I had a cross around my neck. They said I shouldn't wear a cross. Don't have angels in your house because you shouldn't worship anything that isn't Jesus Christ. So I have a conflict of interest they're both Christian, but I don't understand why it seems like they're almost against each other, in a sense.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. What's your name? Melissa. Thank you, Melissa. I remember I was in front of my house. I had been a Christian for about 2 or 3 years. Now, I was a Muslim before, so I was a Unitarian. I didn't believe in the Trinity. Like Jehovah's Witnesses, they don't believe in the Trinity either, which is, by the way, a big deal. That's a big difference. They don't even believe in the divinity of Christ. They don't believe that Jesus is God. And the Bible teaches that he is God. So there's some big differences there. And it matters. Those things actually matter for a reason. So I'm sitting there outside of my house. I bought it a year and a half ago or whatever it is this time. And I'm sitting outside, and I'm watering this Japanese maple tree I just planted. And so I was a Muslim. I was a Unitarian who didn't believe Jesus was God. He was a prophet and no more than that. So I'm watering my Japanese maple. Up walk these 2 Jehovah's Witnesses, both of whom are Middle Eastern. One's Iraqi and one's Syrian, or Jordanian. So this is the start of a joke, right? A former Unitarian Arab Christian is met by 2 former Trinitarian, now Unitarian, former Christians as well. But they're Jehovah's Witnesses now. It's like the start of a big joke, right? So they come into my house, and I'm like, I'm so glad you're here. Let's have a chat. Let's talk. And we did. We talked for a long time, and various times they kept on coming back to the house. I wanted to center around the things that make the biggest difference to me. It's not the blood transfusion thing. It's not the, don't celebrate Christmas and birthdays. That stuff is fine, whatever. The Apostle Paul says some celebrate certain days and others don't celebrate them. You are free to decide which one. The witnesses say, no, you're not free. But Paul says you are. So I already have a problem with that because Paul was the first Christians, not them. And he saw the Lord. And he was inspired. So if you disagree with Paul, I already have a problem with you. So sit down with them and start talking to them. I want to focus on two things. Well, actually, three things, because the third thing flows from the first two. Is God a triune God? Is he a Trinity? And second, is Jesus God? Because then, what was the point of the cross in the first place? Because their two answers to those two questions change what the cross is about. It changes it. And so a Christian is not someone who believes in these sets of rules, and you get baptized at this age, you don't eat these things, you don't worship these things. That's not what a Christian actually is. That stuff is all the accoutrement that gets you to Christianity, but that's not the thing that makes you a Christian. What Paul says in Romans is that if you believe in your heart that God rose Jesus from the dead, and you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, that's what makes you a Christian. Jesus is Lord. Now, he's not a Lord, because Jehovah's Witnesses believe that Jesus is the Archangel Michael incarnated. That's what they believe. They believe he is the Archangel Michael. He was created. He began. He's not eternal. He began. And that's an important difference because we believe what the Scripture says, which is that he, in the beginning, was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And he was the firstborn of all creation and all these things. So there's a fundamental difference there. Who is Jesus? So I appreciate the form of your question because you got right to the heart of it. They say they follow Christ. They say they follow Christ. How can there be so much conflict? It depends on what you mean by Christ. Because Muslims follow Isa al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah, or Jesus the Christ. But they don't follow him as a Lord. They follow him as a prophet. So you can use the same word, but what do you mean by that word? Because there's a lot wrapped up in it. So you use the word Jesus Christ. Christ is not his last name. Christ is a title. He is the anointed one. He is the Messiah. What does it mean to be Messiah? You look at the Old Testament scriptures, and all of them point to the Messiah being born into this world in a human nature, but also bearing a divine nature. He is God on earth. And the witnesses deny that. They deny that. They say it's not true. And they go to great pains, by the way, to try to change the Bible so that it happens. If you look at the New World Translation, their translation, the NWT, and you look at it, John chapter 1 says, in every other Bible in the world, John chapter 1 says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. They changed it. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. They changed that. Colossians chapter 1, verses 14 and 15, where the Bible says that by Jesus, all things were made. That's what it says. You go to the New World Translation, and they changed it. By Jesus, all other things were made. Now, you look at the New World Translation, go look at it right now, and you'll see in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15, you'll see the word other is in brackets. So I asked these two people who came to my house, why is it in brackets? I know why. I just want to see if they know why. And they said, well, that's a clarifying word. A clarifying word. So you inserted a word to clarify the meaning. Or did you change the meaning? You didn't clarify it. It isn't there. Look at the interlinear translations, the translations from the actual Greek. The word other is completely not there, and they added it in their translation. So then I asked them, who translated this Bible? World Translation. What scholars? What credentials do they have? What qualifications do they have? Oh, no, the committee's a secret to keep people from getting conceited. It's for humility's sake. I'm like, well, for humility's sake or for lack of accountability's sake? Because their Greek translation is pretty bad. So you can see that they did this over and over again where they changed things, and whether it was Charles Taze Russell or Rutherford and all these guys, they changed. You can see where they changed stuff, and they made false predictions about the future. Now, here's why people call it a cult. Okay, here's why they call it a cult. There is a phenomenon in the witnesses called disfellowshipping. I don't know if you're familiar with this.
I was going to get to that.
Yeah. So a cult is... So the witnesses are a cult in the classical definition. I don't mean like David Koresh or whatever kind of cults. I don't mean that. What I mean in the classical definition is a cult is any form of Christianity that looks like the real thing but changes important things, like the Trinity and the incarnation of Jesus and him dying on a cross. They believe he died on a torture stake. So they changed fundamental things. And what did he die for? He didn't really die to offer all of us salvation. We still have to work for it. We still have to work it out. So where's I going with this? So what happens with disfellowshipping is that if you even question, you go to the elders, and the elders will answer your question. And if you have more questions, at some point, they're like, you either are in or you're out. And if you're out, everyone has to act like you're dead. Your parents, your brothers, your sisters, your close friends who were all within the watchtower, who are all witnesses, have to act like you don't even exist. The non-classical definition of a cult is one person or organization that holds so much sway and power that when you're excommunicated, there is no hope of redemption. You are out. The only people who go to hell are the ones who don't believe in what they say in terms of their authority. Now, Jesus is not the same. Jesus says, you're going to hell anyway. I'm here to save you from that. But the witnesses are saying, obey our authority, our on-earth authority. And if you don't, we'll disfellowship you. It's a mode of control.
Yeah, I was studying with them, and people kept telling you, there's going to come a time where they're going to make you make a decision. And if you decide you don't want to do it, they're pretty much going to
Yeah.
get rid of you. So it came the time when they said, hey, like you've been studying for quite some time, like 3 years. Have you made a choice of what you're going to do? And I was like, I'm sorry, but like I'm going to stay a Christian. And they eventually said, like, we love you, we enjoyed the time that we spent with you, but like we're going to stop Bible studying with you.
Yeah.
And I was really upset. Like I broke down and cried, and I was like, I just don't understand. Like we both love God, and why can't I still study with you when we have the same faith? You know?
Right.
And so it was disheartening, but you know, all in all, when it all comes down to it, I'm thankful that I met them because they are the person that brought me to God. Wherever I got there, whatever confusion I've had,
Yeah.
I grew a bond with God, and I have been so blessed, and I'm just so thankful for them.
And God, you know what God does? God does this amazing thing where he brings you through a winding path. And sometimes you'll find someone who'll get you some of the truth, but there's also, it's pure milk laced with arsenic, and you have to make sure you can strain that out because it makes you a little sick, but it does get you a little nourishment and you're on your way. So there's little forms of the truth that get you to the ultimate truth, and I think that's a beautiful thing. So I'm grateful that they got you to the place where you could discern what the truth actually is, and then you can say, okay, thank you, but I've grown, and I'm beyond this now. And now you have a full relationship with him. So I think, Paul says this, there are those who preach Christ out of selfish ambition, and there are those who preach Christ because they love the gospel. Who am I to say, stop it? I mean, I'm going to judge false teachers harshly, of course, but if they bring you to the real thing, thank God. But you have to notice it's the real, genuine article. And you notice it now, and you see it, and that's the difference. What do you mean by Jesus? What do you mean by Christ? And they couldn't be more different. But now you have the real, genuine article. And for that, I couldn't be more grateful. That's terrific. Yeah, you bet. I'm good.
Hello, my name's Wadeb.
Hi.
So my question was, how can you, can being atheist be rationalized, right? Because if you can't really quite rationalize anything, like we can't rationalize how, God was made. Like, how do we know that he was like spaceless or timeless, right? And how do you rationalize like heaven and hell when, you're dead? And when you make something, like, you can't make something out of the item that was already made, like matter. So I think I'm just like kind of lost on the, like, how do you rationalize this, and how do you rationalize this religion?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So a couple of things is what I was trying to point out during my remarks is that the idea of rationalization in the first place doesn't make any sense unless there's actually some intelligibility to the universe in the first place. So if I were to create a laptop, or to give you a laptop, and I said, here, do your taxes, report to the federal government accurately what it was you made last year, lest there be consequences. And here's a good laptop for you to use. But by the way, this laptop took 10,000 years to create because a tornado was blowing in a parts factory, and it came together like this. You're going to trust that? Of course you won't. Why would you trust your brain if it was made that way? If your brain was made with no purpose in mind and blind, pitiless, indifferent evolution somehow created all these things to happen so that your brain comes forward and there's this thing, I wouldn't trust something that was made that way, yet we do it all the time. Your question is an intelligible question. It's a logical question because your brain is interacting with, I think, an immaterial mind to produce something that's logical so we can all respond to it. But if your brain was made, I think, by completely irrational or non-rational forces, this is the only thing we say is somehow okay. Whenever we see intelligibility, whenever we see it in life, every single time, we always assume an intelligence behind it. When you see my Apple Watch, you do not think it was randomly created. You know there was a designer. Anything that looked even remotely close to designed, we think there's a designer behind that. And I don't mean just complex. I mean with functional specificity. Okay, so if I took a box of alphabet cereal and I threw it up in the air and all the alphabet cereal bits fell on the ground, okay, it would be an incredibly complex array of letters. I could never recreate that exact spacing and all that stuff. If I did it a billion more times, it just wouldn't happen. So it's incredibly complex, and it's highly unlikely, super, super, super improbable. But now, let's say I threw up the alphabet cereal in the air, and it landed, and in the middle of the array of letters, it said, Abdu, I'm Jesus, I love you. Now you'd think the fix was in. Now you'd think there was some design behind this whole thing. That doesn't happen randomly. So they're both random, and they're both highly unlikely, but one's got function to it. One's got a specified complexity, not just a complexity. Your brain is infinitely more specified than that. And so the very fact of your rationality and my rationality screams out an intelligibility behind the whole thing. So that's, I think, one of the premises we have to wrestle with. How can we even get intelligibility? That's why Thomas Nagel and Raymond Tallis, and I can go on and on about all the various philosophers. In fact, the idea that we are not just our brains is becoming more and more popular, not less and less popular, that we're more than our brains. There's something immaterial about us. It's becoming more popular in philosophical circles, not less. So the rationalists are beginning to realize that their rationalizations only make sense if there's something immaterial about us. Now, what's the origin of that? Okay, so if we are a strict materialist, there can be no origin. It being an epiphenomenon and all these fancy terms, those all don't work. Eventually, they all break down. They just don't work because epiphenomenon happening from naturalistic processes that are immaterial itself just doesn't seem to make any sense. You don't see that rising in life. So, back to my original statement. Whenever you see intelligibility, you always see an intelligence that made it. Except for us, for some reason. We think we're the exception. Why are we the exception? In every other area, we're the exception. That's a atheism with the gaps kind of argument to me. Like, we'll figure it out. Well, why? Everything else screams out intelligence, maybe us too. Now the question becomes, how do we justify the existence of that intelligence? Because if that intelligence created us, well, then who created that intelligence? And then who created the intelligence who created that intelligence? And we can go ad infinitum into an infinite loop in the past, right? Well, the answer is no. You can't actually do that. Now, before I get sort of like, you probably are, I don't know if you're aware of like Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and his argument from contingency and all these things. But Leibniz basically said that there are two kinds of things. I think he's right about this. There are two kinds of things in existence. Contingent things and self-existent things, or non-contingent things. A contingent thing is something that cannot be explained by itself. It has to have some other cause to explain its existence. My iPad, my earbuds, the air in this room, you, me, the universe itself. All of them are obviously contingent. They don't have self-existence. They're not by nature self-existent. So everything that's contingent has a prior cause. But you can't go back infinitely in the past. You can't do it. Here's how, and there's a Muslim philosopher named Al-Ghazali who pointed this out. You can't have an infinite regress of things. You just can't do it. I'll give you two examples of this. The first one is this. Imagine a library with an infinite number of books. Now, every book that is odd numbered is red, and every book that is even numbered is black. If I remove all the black books, how many books do I still have? I removed an infinite number of books from the shelf, but how many are left? An infinite number, because all the infinite red books are still there. Let's say I added all the black books back. I added an infinite number of books to an infinite number of books. And how many books do I have? An infinite number. So infinity is a great mathematical concept, but when it comes to real objects, it doesn't actually work, especially not in a closed system like the universe. Second example. If I were to take, let's say, let's go to like, your math classes where we had the integers, we had -1, -2, then we had 0, then 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's say we're at 4. This moment in time was at 4. And the moment in time before it was 3. And the one before it was 2, and then 1, and then 0, and then -1. If there's an infinite regress of moments of time that go backwards, how could you ever count up to now? You can never start because there's an infinite regress, and it's impossible. It's logically impossible for there to be an infinite regress, which means this: there has to be something that exists outside of the universe with all of its space-time issues that is itself timeless and spaceless to be the stopping point. There has to be a non-contingent being. All other contingent beings are explained by a non-contingent being. So there's got to be something that's non-contingent. It never begins to exist. It just exists eternally, always, in and of itself. Now, there's a couple of there's a couple of candidates for that. Some candidates for eternally existent beings are like abstract objects, like numbers, like the number 7. Does that exist, or is it an idea? And people go back and forth about it. Or love, or the idea of books. There are books, but the idea of books is abstract, right? Here's the problem. Abstract ideas don't do anything. Like, you never bumped into the number 7 and said, ooh, sharp. You never did that, right? They can't do anything. They're effete. They have no causal properties. So the thing that is a non-contingent being that always existed has to be able to cause things. And the only other candidate we can think of for a non-contingent, eternal existent being that causes stuff to happen is God. That's actually the definition, classically, across all theisms, that God is the eternally existent, non-contingent being who causes all other beings to exist. So you don't have an infinite regress. You don't have to worry about that because God is not the kind of thing that begins to exist in the first place. So that's how you can rationalize that a God can eternally exist, because he exists outside of time, and so therefore he has no infinite regress because time doesn't even apply to him. Why is he enormously powerful? Because he created all of the energy that's collected in the universe itself. And that's a lot of energy. And that he's got a different kind of energy than an eternally existent energy, but by the way, that doesn't dissipate. The universe has entropy. Entropy is the state of organization of matter and energy in the universe. And if you know your not your astrophysics, but you know your physics, you know that energy gets dissipated over time. We go from order to disorder. Things don't get magically more ordered. If you leave your car outside, it's not going to get better and better. It's going to get worse and worse. That's entropy. The universe is experiencing the same exact thing. And so at some point, all the energy in the universe will be dissipated equally across the whole thing, and it'll be a big, flat, featureless disk where there's no movement. Everything will be dead. So the thing that creates that has to be, I think, an immaterial, eternal, and constantly generative energy. God. He sustains the heavens by the word of his power. That's what the Bible says. So you see that, and then you see all the intelligence in the design of life. And this God not only can cause things, but he can make choices, because it could have been different. And then this same God actually enters into history as one of us, lives a perfect life because he's perfect, so he has no debts of his own to pay. Jesus doesn't have any debts to pay because he's perfect, which means he's the perfect person to pay my debt for me. You can't pay my debt for me. You have your own. I can't pay mine. You pay yours for you. I have my own. But Jesus owes no debts to God himself, to God the Father, because God the Son is perfect. And so when he is on that cross, that's why the witnesses are wrong. Because if he is not God the Father, if he's not God the Son, then he's not perfect. And if he's not perfect, he can't pay my debt. He's got his own issues to worry about. But if he's God the Son, incarnate, then he can pay my debt for me. And so the Trinity of God the Father, God the Son, God the Spirit, who are all one God, but three different minds within the Trinity, one of them comes down to this earth and pays a debt to the Father, and really pays a real debt. And so the Christian faith, from philosophy to science to history to theology, is cohesive. All of it makes sense of everything else. Are there deep questions still? You bet. I got tons. But the biggest questions, the deep questions, are answered. I think that's how you rationalize it. Otherwise, we're just meat computers responding to external stimuli. But I don't think you think of yourself that way, and I don't think of myself that way. And if you do think of yourself that way, how do you know it's true? You're just a meat computer. But you know some things are true. And rationalization gets you to the truth. Thank God he gave you a mind as bright as it is. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you. Okay. Can I say one thing? Guys, thank you so much for the invitation. And Colin, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure to be with you guys. Terrific questions. I'm going to stick around and be at the table and we can talk and all that stuff. One thing that's interesting to me when I look at a thing like a skeptic's night, and I don't know you guys, so I don't know whether you're a skeptic or not of the Christian faith. I hope you're skeptical about a lot of things, not about Jesus, or at least not anymore. Maybe you still are. That's okay too. There's a difference. Let me say two things to you. There's a difference between being a skeptic and being a cynic. A skeptic is someone who won't believe until there's enough evidence. That's great, because I believe God will give you enough evidence at some point. A cynic is someone who won't believe even when there is. And the question is, which are you at any given moment? And you ask yourself that question, am I cynical or am I skeptical? And what's made me this way? Last thing from G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton said this. He said, joy is the gigantic secret of the Christian, because for the Christian, the peripheral questions don't have all the answers, but the fundamental questions do. But misery is the gigantic secret of the skeptic, because the peripheral questions might have answers, but the fundamental questions still are a mystery. What I'm inviting you to, if you don't already know him, what I'm inviting you to is the gigantic secret of the Christian, which is joy, to have the fundamental questions of life answered in your life and in mine. So if you don't know him, talk to the folks here at this church. They would love to pray with you. If you know someone who doesn't know him, bring them along and experience what it means to be in communion and fellowship with him. And if you're a baby Christian and you're just someone who's working all this out, keep coming. It gets clearer and clearer. You won't have all the answers, but you'll have enough. God bless you guys. Thank you.